Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the first module of the Foundations of the Craft course for Theophania, and this section of the module is on theory. So I am so excited that you could join us today. So the very first thing I want to do is go through a little bit about, like, what is this thing that is paganism or witchcraft or Wicca? And I have many different hats. One of them is also as an academic. I'm a scholar who does research on contemporary paganism, and the first thing that I can tell you is that there is no 100% agreed upon use of terminology. There just is not. Something aggravates someone no matter what. So, however, in general, there is a kind of a general understanding that when we're talking about paganism, witchcraft, or Wicca, we're in the same kind of community. So I'm going to talk about contemporary paganism as a movement. And like I said, there's a lot of different traditions that sort of fall into this in the way in which I'm talking about it. Now, contemporary paganism has a number of historical antecedents. There are a number of things that kind of make up the ground from which contemporary paganism as a movement grows up. And the main one is inspiration from these ancient cultures. And this is taking inspiration both from the imagination of ancient cultures, but also contemporary pagans as a group do tend to read a lot of scholarship, as well as in those traditions have original sources, a lot of original sources. So my experience has been that contemporary pagans do take very seriously trying to understand what the ancient traditions were about, and that inspiration and continuation and re-establishing of various relationships with the old deities, with old strings of power for ritual and so forth, is a significant part of what is behind, or that ground from which contemporary paganism arises. Also, ceremonial magic. There are a number of different Western ceremonial magical traditions that are important in the ground from that births contemporary paganism. So you have things like the Kabbalistic traditions, Rosicrucian, alchemical traditions, and so forth, some of these various ceremonial magical traditions. Additionally, folk magic is another part of what is there kind of in the soil. And this is folk magic of a lot of the different Christian traditions, that may be some of the surviving pre-Christian parts that are coming through kind of that folk magic tradition, because there are various folk magic traditions that you can look at and you can pretty clearly trace them back to some pre-Christian antecedents. But also there's just a lot of generally kind of folk magic parts and places in which things are combined. So this is a large part of the European traditions, but it also does include folk magic traditions from other places as well. In addition to that, there's an inspiration from a lot of the non-Western traditions. And this is coming out of a couple of different places. In the 19th century, you have the Theosophical Society, which is trying to pull in and bridge both a lot of the Western esoteric and ceremonial kinds of traditions with some of the Eastern philosophical and metaphysical traditions. And the Theosophical Society, of which I am also a part, that does kind of bring a lot of the Eastern traditions in. And a lot of our language for talking about things, a lot of our conceptions do actually have their roots, not just in Eastern traditions, but Eastern traditions as they are brought in through Theosophy and put in conversation with Western traditions, such as whenever you talk about karma or chakras, which in the Sanskrit is chakra, things of that nature. All of these sorts of things are coming originally through the Theosophical Society into conversation with the Western esoteric. But there's also some inspiration that comes in through various First Nations and other traditions of that sort. In particular, an emphasis on some of the First Nations practices as they have to do with ecology, because another part of the ground here is the understanding from ecological and environmental movements that there is a spiritual aspect to nature that we need to be in communication with. So all of those kind of make up the groundwork in which you have contemporary paganism emerging as a new religious movement. So when I say it's a new religious movement, what I mean is that it is my belief, and I think it's based on some pretty good historical analysis, that contemporary paganism, including Wicca, arise in the 20th century. And that's really where they're coming from. And that although they may have some groundedness in these older things, they are not an unbroken tradition that has been passed on one to the other from pre-Christian times. I do not believe that we have good evidence of that. One of the challenges that we often have in contemporary paganism is what I call bullshit pagan history. We do not need bullshit pagan history. And I think that originally came about when there was some concern about legitimacy within the dominant culture. And to me, what I would say with that is, why are you looking at the dominant culture for your legitimacy? Just stop doing that. So it is my belief, take this as my belief, that we do not have an unbroken tradition of like initiatory craft from pre-Christian times. But there are a lot of historical antecedents that are real. And if what we believe, and it's what I believe, is that we are in relationship with some of the beings that, including the great ones, some of the old gods, that we are in relationship with them, then it does not matter to me if there was an unbroken lineage, if we can learn things directly from them again. So that's a bit of mine. So I would say when we're talking about contemporary paganism, we're talking about a new religious movement that has a number of very important historical antecedents that make up the ground from which it arose. I want to go through a little bit of terminology. And again, there is not agreement on these bits of terminology, but I do want to at least give you a sense of how I'm using them. When I talk about pagan, I am talking about the movement that is, it is comprised, I'm using it as an umbrella term, that is comprising a number of different traditions that all take this inspiration from pre-Christian various traditions, mostly in Europe and the Near East, those areas that Christianity first kind of arose and then went up into Europe. And so that would include things like the heathens that take their inspiration from the ancient Norse. It would include things like the Kemetic people that take their inspiration from Egypt. You know, and also all of these different traditions that are taking their inspiration from different parts of those groups. Wicca is the largest at this historical moment subtype of paganism, and it historically arises from the work of Gerald Gardner, and then there are some other traditions that arise, some of them directly coming out of Gardner, some of them coming up in roughly the same kind of time, a little bit different formulations. But the deal with those originally is that they were initiatory traditions that were lineage based, which means that you had to be initiated by a Wiccan to become a Wiccan. Now, later, at this historical moment, the vast majority of Wiccans are actually self-initiated solitaries. But in general, in Wicca, you have a set of kind of coherent traditions and ways of doing things. It includes working within casting a circle. It includes things like generally agreed upon festivals for marking a ritual calendar year, emphasis on both some solar festivals as well as some lunar festivals that track the moon. and a general understanding that you are working with both God or gods and goddesses or goddess. So you can have eclectic, which is what I am, which is drawing from a number of different traditions, or you can have things that are in a very specific lineage, like Gardnerian, Alexandrian, what have you. Okay, so witches. Now, some witches are also Wiccans. Some witches do not consider themselves Wiccans. Some Wiccans do not consider themselves witches. But the big thing here is that witch is a term, and that is emphasizing a magical approach to reality, and is also kind of an oppositional identity in a lot of ways. And in particular, it was very important for a lot of feminist witches to claim this term, and I am one of them. And so to me, part of what you're doing when you're saying, I am a witch, is that you are creating an oppositional kind of identity in which you are challenging the assumptions about the perception of feminine power. And so witches are very much into claiming power. But the idea here is that you are working with the invisible aspects of reality. So it's got a very strong magical element to it. And so now I want to talk quickly about magic. So magic, and sometimes you'll see it with a K to distinguish it from stage magic, which is all about illusion as opposed to something real. What magic is that magic is a practice, a set of practices in which you are creating change by utilizing causation that is different than what can be normally observed through the physical senses. Let's put it that way. So you're using causation that is different than that you use in daily life. You're using causation in some of the various kind of invisible ways of being. And that doesn't mean that you're not necessarily doing anything that you can observe visibly, but it's just that the particular type of causation, it requires a different perspective of the nature of reality, which is a magical worldview. And we're going to be going through that because that is behind part of what is there in all of the different pagan traditions, I would say, is a magical worldview. Now, an occultist, sometimes you'll see this as put up as a pair of opposites, occultist versus mystic, if you see that in any of the literature. An occultist is someone who is occult means hidden. It's dealing with the hidden side of reality, and there are occult traditions that are dealing with the hidden side of reality, sometimes esoteric. That just means like inner. It's that literally is from Greek, eso and exo. It just means inner versus outer. So you're dealing with the hidden nature of reality, and again, that tends to like work well with magic, which actually is also related to wisdom. Just so you know, magi. But so an occultist, though, tends to, in the literature, be focused more on having a philosophical or scientific understanding about the nature of reality, whereas a mystic, which is also dealing with some of the invisible aspects around reality, especially around the invisible unity that underlies all things, tends to be more of a heart-centered path is the way in which we often think about it. So we often think about like an occultist being more of a head-centered path and a mystic being more of a heart-centered path. But then all of the teachings also say that at the highest levels, they merge and are really one. So, but I would say that a mystic is someone who is often on a little bit more of a devotional path than an occultist sometimes. So anyway, those are kind of just some basic terms that you might run into. So this course is being offered through Theophania. So what is Theophania? So Theophania is a coven of the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, which is a particular tradition. It's an eclectic Wiccan tradition. It is initiatory, and it is organized. So it is in person and is not solitary. So, and it has its headquarters in Delaware, but Theophania itself is in Washington, D.C. So I will be talking more about initiations, what is an initiatory path, and so forth in a later segment, but that is the assembly of the sacred wheel, and Theophania is a coven, so a small ritual group within that is, because like covens are initiatory and they are small working groups within Wicca that are membership based. So Theophania itself is specifically under the charge of, or under the aegis of, some Hellenic context. Hellenic is Greek. It's just the Greek word for Greek. And in particular, Apollon, Apollo, and Athena. Now, I myself received a call from Apollon and Athena a number of years ago to build for them a place, a vessel, a vehicle that they could use to have a presence in the nation's capital, in Washington, D.C. And I said yes to that calling, and I serve them both as priestess and am particularly close in my own personal practice with Apollon, although both of them. So Theophania is working under their aegis and is a part of answering that call. So, we are specifically under their tutelage. So now I want to talk about paganism and the craft as alternative culture. This is something that I think is the most important to be thinking about, like, what is this enterprise that pagans are involved in? And I think a lot of times that having a functional analysis is important because it keeps us focused on what is it that we're really trying to do here. And this is my take on paganism as alternative culture. Now, first of all, within the history of the United States, and this may be different in different countries, but within the United States, although there were Wiccans and pagans in the United States prior to the 1960s counterculture, that is really where it began to spread and grow, was within the context of the 1960s counterculture. Now, I was not alive at that point in time myself, but the counterculture essentially was trying to create alternatives to the culture that they were in at that point. And I would say with very mixed success. But it was rooted in the idea that there was something really wrong with the dominant American culture. And in particular, it required a spiritual type of solution. And they began looking for and experimenting with many different spiritual traditions. And that is, like I said, the emergence of contemporary paganism has a large part of its roots in the United States in the 60s counterculture. Another group where you have this strong countercultural influence is with feminists. And this is feminism in several different waves. There's second wave feminism, third wave feminism, but there's this emphasis, and you see the craft and paganism being taken in as part of feminist countercultural movements. This emphasis that on reclaiming the divine feminine and on reclaiming what is truly female and feminine power, however that is understood. And by that, I don't mean, just cisgender. I mean feminine power, the power of everything that is there associated with femaleness in all of its different orientations. But like I said, so the recurrence of a lot of the goddess worship and so forth is all part of feminist counterculture that comes up in Wicca. Also, the environmental movement, the idea that there are beings in nature with whom we are in relationship, and there are nature spirits, and all of this, like our relationship with the earth, our relationship with all of the natural beings, that it has a spiritual element. And so you have the inroads and the of contemporary paganism into the environmental movement and vice versa. So all of these are going both ways, in that you have people who are contemporary pagans already who become feminists and take some of that more in, and then you have people who are feminist and who are looking for spiritual kind of foundation for their feminism, who come to the craft, people who are already pagan into the environmental movement driven by their understanding of nature spirits and the sacredness of nature, and people who are in the environmental movement who are drawn into paganism because they are looking for a way to resacralize their relationship with nature. So all of these are flowing, you know, in multiple ways here. And then you have the LGBTQ, trans liberation movement, all of these different minority sexualities, including like a lot of the other expressions of minority sexuality, like various kinds of kink culture and so forth. Again, you have this sort of those people who are in those liberation movements looking for a sacred expression find their way into various forms of contemporary paganism. Those people who are contemporary pagans who have been doing a lot of work on resacralizing their relationship with sexuality see these movements and go flowing into them, you know, so it's going both ways in all of these different things. So there is a strong countercultural relationship in numerous different countercultural movements that are related in this kind of symbiotic relationship with contemporary paganism. So my understanding, and again, this is my understanding, is that a huge part of kind of the project mission statement, if you will, of like, what is it that contemporary paganism is really about, has to do with redressing miasma and the dominant culture by creating alternatives. So what do I mean by miasma? Miasma is an ancient Greek term, and it literally translates into spiritual pollution. But what is it? What, you know, if you go and you look at like ancient texts around miasma, the first thing you're going to see is a whole bunch of ritual rules. And I don't think that that's really the important thing. I think the important thing is, what are those ritual rules actually like leading us to at a higher level? And I understand miasma to be the spiritual pollution that comes from being out of right relationship. And that can be out of right relationship with the gods, out of right relationship with nature, out of right relationship with each other, out of right relationship with ourselves, out of right relationship with our ancestors, out of right relationship with, you know, any of the myriad of beings that we're in relationship with. And I would say when I do analysis, functional analysis, and I am a big proponent of doing functional analysis because I think that helps us focus our attention. When I do functional analysis of our dominant culture, I see a whole bunch of miasma, a whole bunch of places where we're really, really badly out of right relationship. So one of them is, you know, this idea that it's kind of like the, if you're not like us, then that makes you bad. And I think on the one hand, that's a kind of human problem a lot of times. We certainly see this, but I also think that there's a particular way in which monotheistic traditions that say there's only one God, you know, there's only one, and then it gets combined with a particular type of kind of evangelical conversion religion. And I don't mean evangelical like we mean now, but I mean really that kind of conversion religion, that the need, when you see monotheism combining with a need to convert others, that quickly becomes a particularly disturbing, toxic mix. And that is not in all Christianity by a stretch of the imagination, but it's there in Christianity, historically and current. It's not there in all aspects of Islam, but it's there in certain aspects of Islam and always has been. So there is an aspect here. And like I said, it's not all Christians and it's not all of Christianity. It's not all Muslims. It's not all of Islam, but there are aspects of it in both that I think emphasize and put a different kind of particularly dangerous point on that. If you're not like us, then you're bad because you're against God. I mean, that's a whole other thing. Another thing that I see in our dominant culture that is really problematic is that we have a propensity, especially in capitalism, to instrumentalize life and living things. We put an overwhelming emphasis on productivity and at the cost of relationship, at the cost of holistic understanding of things. So there is a propensity to instrumentalize pretty much everything, to turn the equivalent of turning living beings into things. We reduce living beings also to attributes, to adjectives, and then we don't really see them. It's if you categorize everyone and you just have them sorted according to a bunch of different adjectives, while that might make you more efficient at instrumentalizing them, it will keep you cut off from that kind of I-thou relationship that Martin Buber talks about as an example. I see in our society that we have a propensity to focus on modes of power that have a lot more, they're based on zero-sum thinking, on this idea that there's a limited amount of power, a limited amount of resource, a limited amount of whatever, and that if you win, you take it from me. So this kind of like competitive aspect, not competitive from like the let's try to be our best selves, but competitive from the your winning is taking something from me. Your excellence takes away from mine versus me being inspired by your excellence to increase my excellence. So there's a lot of power over and externalized power. The locus of power is outside me rather than finding my power within myself as an expression of the nature of my being. This is also working with toxic individualism in this particular culture, and that always tends to accompany some really tough existential alienation as part of it, and a lot of just insecurity. So one of the other things that is really deeply problematic that I see in our culture is that we have a propensity to see everything within pairs of opposites. And one of the most natural, in quotes, ways of determining opposition or of categorizing opposition is to link it into gender. So you start applying gender to like everything. And, you know, you see everything as like masculine. This is masculine, that is feminine, you know. The body is feminine, but the mind is masculine, which is nonsense. I mean, you know, both men and women have bodies and minds. Like, what is that? I mean, it's total nonsense. So it's kind of a heuristic way of dividing up the world. But then what happens when you combine that in with misogyny, this propensity to see things as pairs of opposites, is to make one good, one bad. And often what ends up happening is that everything that gets associated with the feminine is considered bad. And I mean, this is just a really messed up way of looking at reality in general. I mean, why don't we look at things as complements? And why do we have to do that? It's just like nonsense. So, an unhealthy nonsense. Okay, so anyway, I want to talk then about this idea that if we understand our dominant culture as being enmeshed in a lot of miasma, what does this have to do with this idea of paganism? So one of the things here that happens is our relationship with ancient pagan religions. Ancient pagan religions did not die a natural death after they had reached the end of their ability to spiritually inspire and enlighten people. That is so not remotely what happened. And I should probably give you a warning so you can take this with a serious salt lick, but it is my belief that I don't just study a lot of the ancient Greek religions in particular, but I believe that I have a whole lot of past life memories. And I have not a little bit of anger right under the surface on some of the early things, especially at Theodosius and Justinian. So, in fact, one might even say I have some serious anger issues with them. But the point here is that the early Christian church, although they like to portray themselves as a bunch of martyrs, were like pretty kind of like Al-Qaeda. I mean, I'm going to be honest, they're kind of like Al-Qaeda in a lot of ways. I mean, you know, you have these roving bands, and we do have some ancient resources that are primary texts that actually talk about this. But, you know, they would rove around and attack people on their way to the temple. And then, you know, and you have letters going to the emperor saying, you've got to do something. And finally, with the way in which they reacted is that Theodosius forcibly closed all the temples. I mean, you know, he just forcibly closed them all. And then you have the outlawing of not just, you can't go to temple anymore, you can't sacrifice to the old gods in any kind of way that you've been doing, since time immemorial, but you're also no longer permitted to have your household practice. That becomes outlawed. And then what becomes outlawed is that if you find out that your neighbor is practicing personal household devotion to the old gods and you don't report them, then you're in trouble. So, I mean, it is not at all that this was like a thing where people just naturally turned away and, became Christian. I mean, obviously there were some people who did, but paganism died a very violent death. And then as Christianity got combined in with Western imperialism, that spread. And it spread over Europe, and then it spread as Western imperialism spread to this hemisphere and elsewhere in the world. So it is not a peaceful kind of conversion experience. So anyway, it was forcibly ruptured. And part of what happens is that there are various spiritual experiences that do not have a safe place in Christianity. Or probably in Islam either, but I know less about some of that context than I do about the Christian context. So for example, having direct contact with nature spirits, as an example, been happening for forever. And, suddenly you have the fact that if you were to go in that kind of a circumstance where, there's this stamping out of the non-Christian traditions, and you were to say that you're talking to nature spirits, then that puts you in serious danger. And so what you start doing is not talking about it. And this is called being forced into the ontological basement. So it is not that people stopped having some of these experiences. It's that it became dangerous to talk about it. And so you would keep it, if you had unusual experiences, it would become private. You wouldn't say anything necessarily. And if that goes on for long enough, then there's no knowledge associated with those different experiences that's being passed along that could help the person having that experience make meaning of it and have it be integrated into their integral part of who and what they are. So there's a whole lot of spiritual experiences here that are forced into the ontological basement, in which we stop talking about it in the expertise of both, really building on that natural inclination or that experience, the ability to give it meaning, the ability to take somebody who maybe does perceive the spirits and train them so they're a useful seer in their society. All of that is wiped out, and it's hidden and just lost. It's really just lost. And then even after we have the circumstance in which the church as this dominant political force starts to kind of fall away and we move in towards a more materialist culture, all of this stuff is still in the ontological basement. Nobody's talking about it. It's not safe to talk about it, because if you do talk about it, now you're not going to be perceived necessarily as being evil or being, tempted by the devil or whatever. Now you're just going to be seen as crazy. So you're still not going to talk about it. And you're still not given a framework in which to make meaning out of it. And, you're not given the training in how to build on those natural kind of abilities. And there are a number of what we call extraordinary spiritual experiences. And I'll cover those at some other time, but these occur across time and culture, and they're just there. They seem to be part of the human experience, but a lot of those into the ontological basement they go. Okay, so again, as far as kind of like the critique of this, there is a critique here that is in contemporary paganism and our relationship with the ancient pagan religions and why it is that we want to look at them. That is a critique in which the militant version of Christianity, that is combined with this forcible conversion, is the turning point. It is like the turning point in our history that makes our dominant culture. And that this is where we have this shift that is radical and touches on every single aspect, pretty much, of our various Western cultures. And that it didn't have to happen. And so therefore there are alternatives. So part then of what we're doing is we're looking back and we're saying, wait a second, if this is what's happening and there's this moment that is this shift, and it's not just like a single moment, it's over time, but this is a set of historical events that maybe didn't have to happen, that means that there might be things prior to that that we could reclaim that were suppressed or discarded that give us alternatives to where we are now. And maybe we should go back and do some like spiritual excavation and look at some of those things. Now, from my perspective, the way to approach this is to look at these various forms of knowledge and what was there before and the ancient pagan traditions for inspiration and for finding knowledge. Again, that kind of excavation idea. But for the purposes of trying to create new patterns from where we are now, create new alternatives, not to try to rebuild what was there before. I don't think it would work, and I don't think it is necessarily appropriate either. There are definitely things in the ancient world that I have no desire to go back to. But I think there's a lot of things there that can both create those kind of inspirational moments, and also that there are relationships with the great ones and with other spirits that we just need to rebuild those bridges, and they're there. And in my experience, they're waiting for us. They're waiting for us. They want to see these relationships rebuilt. And that there are lines of power in certain parts of rituals that we can just tap back into and, you know, rebirth some of this power back into our contemporary circumstance. So a large part of what I see contemporary paganism as being is a visionary call. It's a call for us to envision a new world and envision the kind of society we want to live in. And we are being called to find the parts of ourselves that we're unaware of, parts of ourselves and our own being that have been suppressed, that have been forced into the ontological basement. We're being challenged to reclaim our true full power. In Greek, there's this idea of arete, which is, it gets translated as both excellence, but also as virtue. But if you think of it as virtue, the original meaning of virtue, and again, it's there in arete, the idea of herbalism, that is the purified living essence of a living being, that we are being called upon to find all of those aspects in ourselves and to allow them to unfold and to step into our true full humanity. We're being asked to reclaim our relationships with the great ones, our relationships with our ancestors, with the various aspects of nature and all of these different spirit beings, and to really deepen our relationships and our idea of what relationship is. What is a relationship really? It is so much deeper than the models we are often given, especially kind of, you know, in this society. I'm going to put in again some of my probable bias, but in our current society, the only form of intimacy that we really celebrate is sexual intimacy. I mean, that's it. That's so limiting. And I'm not saying anything against it. It's great, whatever. But, you know, but the point is, it's like, that is like one teeny tiny part of all of the different myriad of intimate relationships in which you can really touch other beings soul to soul. And, you know, to be limited, and in this society, it's supposed to be a monogamous, heterosexual, you know, it's so limiting. There are a lot of different forms of intimacy and a lot of different types of depth of relationships. So anyway, I want us to envision and experiment with alternative ways of being as part of this visionary call that I think we're getting from paganism. And the other thing that I would say is that I believe that these kinds of relationships, or these kinds of modes of being that we are, if you're on an esoteric path, is always about being on the bleeding edge of things. It's always about being on the bleeding edge. You're always pushing forward. Okay, so part of the Assembly of the Sacred Wheels mission is to re-enchant the earth. there is an old Max Weber kind of thing of like, we live in a disenchanted world. And many of us would say, we don't live in a disenchanted world. We're forced into the ontological basement. So what we really want to do is we want to re-enchant the earth. And part of this, I'm going to go through a number of these pretty quickly, and then I will build on them in later videos. But there's this idea of the greater earth, and the greater earth means that we are a part of this planet, and that all of the different things that we physically see, that's only one aspect. There's all sorts of beings and planes of existence that are part of the earth that are not physical, and that we are in relationship with all of them. We are in relationship with all of the different beings that are a part of this planet. There's a view of reality that sees everything as growing and developing on all levels. The work of all living beings is to unfold, to grow, and to develop. And that this is a large part of what spiritual evolution is about. That just means growing and evolving on all the different levels of being, including all of those that are not in the physical. So everything is evolving consciousness. It's this idea of growing and evolving. And I call this Earth School. And I carry around that idea of Earth School in my head. Like, we are all right now in Earth School. We are all growing. We are all learning. And part of what that means is, like, I try to go through and learn the lessons that I am presented with, whatever those are. And also the idea of having some compassion for myself and for others, because we're all just students in Earth School. And, you know, there are times in which I'm like, oh man, I'm like a kindergartner in that one. Or, you know, there's some area that maybe I've been able to do advanced study in and somebody else is in kindergartner. So, I mean, we're all over the place and taking different courses of study, but I think taking that kind of growth mindset is a really helpful thing. Also, this idea in which everything is conscious and we are in relationship with everything, you know, every single thing, including things that we often think of as inanimate objects. They have a form of consciousness. They might not be exactly like our form of consciousness, but they have a form of consciousness, and we're in relationship with everything. And the question is, are we in right relationship with things? And what can we do to heal relationships that we're not in right relationship with? There's also this idea of reconnecting with spirits, broadening our conscious web of relationships. There's a much more complex understanding of reality, so that, again, it's not just physical plane reality. There's lots of planes of existence. There's lots of invisible aspects of ourselves. So this expanded view of the nature of humans. And that also on those levels, like, you know, there's the aspect of ourselves that is, you know, if you've heard the astral plane, we're on all these different levels of reality ourselves anyway, but it's not just us. There's an entire level of being there. And very importantly, in this idea of trying to re-enchant the earth, is to embrace the divine immanent, the divine that is within everything, within all of this beautiful level of manifestation with all of its myriad expressions, as well as the divine transcendent. And so as part of that, we embrace the sacredness of material reality and reimagine the various nature of power. So what are the modes of power where you can have power that is intrinsic to your being, that idea of ariti again, and power that is shared. So for me, I would say a huge part of why I'm drawn into contemporary paganism, or a part of what contemporary paganism has to give to the world, is this emphasis on empowerment that is not zero-sum thinking. I always say, you know, I really desperately want to be a part of a pride of lionesses, man. It's like, I want you to be in your full power. I want me to be in my full power. You being in your full power helps me be in my full power. That is not a competition. We are working together. And there's this emphasis on joy and beauty. And in particular, a part of the full expression of being a human being is to be a creator. So in our current society, we're often, put in situations where we are just consumers of art. And there is an aspect of us, if we are fully expressing ourselves, is also to be a creator of art. So there are multiple ways of seeing the craft, and I take these from one of my early teachers, Lori Cabot. You can look at the craft as a science. And what I mean by that is, this is particularly a lot of times the magical part. There's the part where you're doing some experimental work, and there are various things that you are doing to participate, and you want to be able to, keep some good records and see what works, what didn't, change things around. Then there's the craft as an art, and part of this is the art also of living. This is the creative aspect. And then there's the craft as religion, and it can really be expressions of all of these. So religion in its ancient, in its original words, religio, it's relinking. But the idea here is that there is an aspect of the craft that involves kind of a devotional aspect of worship of the great ones. So you can be practicing the craft and do just one, just two, all three, but there are different ways of looking at it. And I find that to be a useful thing. So I would encourage you, as you're kind of like, tracking your own journey, stopping every now and then and thinking about, am I approaching this more as a science, an art, or a religion in this moment? So I also want to talk quickly about the magical persona, because I think it's something that is important, and I would encourage you, as you are beginning in this trajectory here, whether or not you are new, or if you're just taking this opportunity to firm up your foundations or take a look at them again with new eyes. So a persona, the word it's Latin, and it refers to the masks that you wear if in ancient theater of tragedy or of comedy. And so it's the mask that you put on while you're on stage and you're projecting out of it. And part of the deal with those old masks is that they helped you project. Okay. So, and then anyone who is seeing you in that mask has some immediate clues to the role that you're playing. So we all have numerous different personas. And, and like I said, it's the mask through which your core self shines. So it's both. So the personality, though, it has to do with kind of like, what are your roles that you're playing in the moment? And so one of the things that can be really, really useful is the creation of an intentional magical personality. So that when you are in the moment in which you're going to be like, and now I am doing magic, it allows you to make a rapid transition from I am now fighting with Quicken and paying my bills. I mean, so it allows you to kind of have that difference where you can step in and be like, and here I am, and it just, doing the ritual leading or whatever. And so creating this magical personality that you can quickly put on like a mask, which, that doesn't mean that it's not real, because it is real. It's just allowing you to aspect certain parts of yourself quickly and express them. That can help you provide a focus. And that's why a lot of witches or magical practitioners use magical names. That is part of building their magical personality. So I want you to start thinking about that as you're going through here. So now I want to talk quickly about some problems of socialization. I've been talking a lot about some of the ways in which our culture, or our dominant culture, or overculture, has a lot of miasma associated with it. When you are approaching a magical path, some of our socialization is really challenging. And one of the great, brilliant things about being a part of a group is that what we're doing is amazing. It is amazing, and it requires courage, and it requires persistence. And the fact that you are spending your time looking at this at all, I praise you. And you know what else? It also means you, my friends, are weird. As am I. I mean, we're doing something that is so outside. It is so outside the understanding and the norms of our dominant culture. It takes a lot. And we have all been socialized and are swimming in the overculture. So there's some things that, you want to keep in your mind and you want to start tracking. And one of them that I didn't actually put on this slide here is shame. I want you to pay attention to any time you start feeling shame and ask yourself, does it serve your growth? I mean, if you happen to be one of those people who hurts people and then feels shame, and that feeling of shame is what is keeping you from hurting people, then maybe it is serving your growth. But I think most of the time, for most of us, the kind of people that are probably going to spend their time watching this video, that's not why they have shame. They have shame because they're not meeting somebody else's expectations. And so really take a look at that, because a lot of the expectations that we are given, that we take on to ourselves, are not necessarily healthy. Okay, so I also want to talk quickly about fixed versus growth mindset. Most of us, including myself, have been very deeply socialized in fixed mindset. Fixed mindset tells you that your characteristics and your abilities, that there's a certain set of parameters around those that are unmoving. So, if you are you think in terms of like talent. And this is very important when you're doing something like magical work. Oh, well, you're a gifted seer. Oh, I'm a gifted seer. All right, well, the danger there, even if it's positive, even if I'm being told like I'm a gifted seer, is that somewhere in the back of my mind, I'm going to have imposter syndrome. I'm going to think, maybe I'm not really a gifted seer. Maybe they're really wrong. And someday, somehow, I'm not going to see something. And then I'm going to know that I am not actually a gifted seer. And my sense of self that I built around that is going to come crashing down, and that's very threatening. So you know what I'm not going to do? I'm not going to try. I am not going to try. I am going to like stay back here, and I'm going to get paralyzed by fear. Or, like this idea that if you're good at something, it just comes naturally to you and you don't have to work at it. So there's a whole bunch of really important research around this, and that this fixed mind mentality, even when we're told that we're good at something, is really detrimental. It is really, really detrimental. Obviously, if you have internalized the idea that you're bad at something, like I am bad at math. I am so bad at math. I have had math phobia my whole life, and this is true. I am now publishing in quantitative journals. It's terrifying, but I'm doing it, and I'm doing an okay job at it. And the vast majority of what I have had to get over is facing my terror around it over and over again, because I was really socialized with a lot of this fixed mindset stuff. So in the way, whether your feedback or your way of thinking is good or bad. Now, growth mindset basically says, I can get better. I can always get better. And, it's not about hitting some target in which you are a good seer. It means that, I am getting better and better. And the more I work at it, the better I will get. And the more I seek out, feedback, the better I will get. So I want you to be like, if you have ever, almost everybody has got some of this at some level. Our entire educational system is largely built around this nonsense. So this is something for you to really be watching. Start making an effort to watch for yourself when you're having a fixed mindset. And when you are having a fixed mindset, or you are reacting in fear, create for yourselves alternative growth-oriented messages. Okay. Another thing, the whirling sides of unbridled skepticism. We are in such an interesting culture as far as like science is great. It has moved us along in so many ways, but like one of the kind of cheap ways for intelligent people to get by is to just be critical of things. And that will totally get in your way with this. So, trying to figure out a way to kind of put that over to the side. So, at the same time, you don't want to be incredulous, but I found by and large, most of the time we're in our way more with the kind of constant judging of ourselves. So we're going to go through more about like the full nature of a human being, blah, 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 all of that. Your talking self is a teeny, teeny, tiny portion of you. But this whirling sides of unbridled skepticism, if that is you, if you have a tendency to constantly doubt yourself, if you have a tendency to constantly doubt your experiences, I want you to start working with yourself to say, I am going to create a hypothesis that I'm just going to accept as a preliminary hypothesis that this stuff is real and that what I'm experiencing is real, and I'm going to allow myself to experience it, and I'm not going to judge myself for a good year. I'm not going to. Now, at the same time, you want to be somewhat realistic, and that, you don't ever want to do something like, I had a vision that I should eat this plant without finding out what the heck that plant is first. I mean, be sensible, but just try to have some kind of openness with yourself and try to keep that under wraps a little bit. Now, if you're somebody who tends to believe everything with no basis of evidence, then you might want to focus on a different form of discernment. But my experience with most people starting this, or not even just starting this, any of us, oh my God, it's like all of us, we're really super, super trained in a type of critical thinking that often is really just giving rein to unbridled skepticism. Another thing is fear. Fear is a very natural emotion. And what I would say in some of this is start watching yourself and start seeing, I don't want you to get into something that would really actually be dangerous. And that's part of the reason we're doing some scaffolding for those people that are new, but just like starting to watch your fear and watch where it's coming from, including for a lot of advanced people, their fear is often about like, what if I look stupid? And again, some of that kind of stuff. What if I don't do it right? What if I forget the words? And so, what if I do the wrong hand signal and I accidentally do the hand signal for like air when I meant it to earth? And, just watch your fear and watch where that's coming from. And, a lot of times people are actually afraid of their success. So I'm going to tell you to like start looking at that. The other thing, of course, is that we're in the attention economy. Fear and anger sell, and the more in which they make you click on stuff, and the more in which we reinforce those circuits, the faster our minds go down them. So, taking this moment to try to like back that off is probably a good idea. So, I have linked here a video that I'm going to encourage you all to watch. And it is a TED Talk that is by Carol Dweck. And if you go into, I've given you a link here, but if you go into YouTube and you put in Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K, and TED Talk, you're going to find it. And this is specifically, she's the main researcher who is doing that fixed versus growth-oriented mindset. And I really encourage you to watch it. It's not very long. I encourage you to watch that. And then the next portion of this is going to be on more of the practical, the praxis part. And I will be back with you later on that. So thank you so much for being here. And I am really grateful. And I hope that this was useful for you. Okay, thanks.